Hey y'all, and welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be looking at a chess game that I played yesterday, which I actually managed to come back from a completely losing position, and it was really nice. So let's just get into the chess. My opponent starts off the game with pawn to e4, and I decide to play the move pawn to c5, which is my most played opening against pawn to c4 now, just because I really like the Sicilian. It makes a lot of sense. It's kind of combative, it's in my style, and it's a fun way to play. And my opponent decides to play the move knight to f3, and we enter a deep amount of theory with pawn to d6, pawn to d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight to c3. This has all been played before. The point of knight to f6 is to force my opponent to play this move knight to c3 and to avoid the move pawn to c4 at some point. And then I like doing the move pawn to g6. At this point, with the idea of going bishop g7, short castles, knight to c6, and just very simple play. My opponent goes pawn to f3. This is another very logical move, stopping this move in some lines to go after this dark-squared bishop. Bishop to g7, bishop to e3, short castles, bishop to c4, and I play knight to c6. And my opponent kind of surprises me here, because if you're going to play this move pawn to f3 in these lines, normally what you do here is you play the move queen to d7, and then you castle long, because of course you've weakened your king side a little bit, and that's just how you're supposed to play the game. My opponent decided not to do that. My opponent decided to castle king side, which is an option. Admittedly, it's not a very good option, because my opponent has opened up this diagonal to his king, and it's just not going to work out too well for him if I'm able to get some pressure there. But here's the first one that I started to think, because normally I have theory in long castles. So I think for a little bit, the top engine move in this position is the move queen to b6, which I thought about a decent amount. But for some reason, I decided to not go with queen to b6 here. And the reason why is because I thought that queen to b6 for some reason didn't work. I thought that queen to b6, my opponent had this move knight to f4. f5, but now that I'm looking at it, I think that this just doesn't work. I think I can just take on b2, and I'm just winning. But yeah, for some reason in the game, I was very concerned about this move knight to f5, trying to go after the bishop. I only calculated that I thought my queen had to go back to c7, and then I'm just completely worse here, obviously, since I lost my strong bishop on the open diagonal here, and nothing really good can come from that. So that was already a pretty big misstep in the position, and instead I decided to go very simple, and I played this move bishop to d7 after 20 seconds of thought, because of course I was miscalculating at this point, and I thought that many things could work when really they just could not. So already there's a bit of a problem here. And that's the fact that my opponent has the center control and I don't really have the center control. Of course, it's completely equal, but in some lines I was worried that my opponent was going to come over on the king side here with moves like pawn to f4, pawn to f5, and maybe some like pawn to e5 at some point, trying to rip apart my king, and then there's some like attack in some lines. Of course, not there right now since that's defended by 2 pieces. But like in the future, my opponent kicks this knight out, my opponent gets some play over there, and I was getting a little bit worried about that. Of course, that's all like theoretical, and none of that is like actually must happen, but it is something to note and something to be a little bit wary of in these structures, so I had to be a little bit careful of that. My opponent played the move queen to d2 though. Now I believe that queen b6 does not work because of the line that I showed. Wait a second, no, does it work? I'm thinking here. Queen to b6. Computer says he has knight e6, but I was thinking queen to b4. Oh, and the difference is here knight f5 doesn't work because of queen b4, and the bishop is defended. Because the knight actually gets trapped in this position. But by going knight e6. Queen b4 takes, he can take this, and his knight gets out. Now I'm just down in exchange. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, the point is now, obviously, after queen to d2, this pawn in b2 doesn't really fork anything because the knight on c3 is well protected. In any case, I played the move rook to c8 after some thought. It seemed very logical. Point is, I see this open file here. You can tell something is an open file, by the way, if there's no pawns on it. There's a pawn here, so it's only a semi-open file. But pieces on a file don't actually make it closed, which is something very interesting, something beginners have to note, because of course, pieces you can break through and pawns you can't really with a rook. So this is why this is considered an open file. I know a little bit of a tangent, but it doesn't really matter. My opponent decides to play the move bishop to b3, very natural. I'll start in some ideas here of knight takes d4 and like getting pressure here. And there could be like some ideas where like the bishop is hanging and then that's just going to win me a piece. So my opponent decides to just not have any of that, play the move bishop to b3, very, very logical. And I decide to put my knight in the middle with the move knight to e5. Very standard move. Point is, my knight is now centralized. If he goes here, I probably can just come here and win the dark squared bishop for the knight. And that should just be an advantage for black. Or I can come here and probably my opponent's going to trade the light squared bishop. I'm going to play like this. And we're going to have a game. Probably white's going to be it's probably going to be equal after that because my opponent has center control. But black has the bishop pair and some compensation. My opponent goes rook a to c1. I decide to go, I don't really understand this move, by the way. I think it might be a mouse slip. Maybe he wanted to go rook here. This move makes a little more sense to me. But if he's going to put a rook there, I'd put this rook there. In any case, my opponent goes rook a to c1. Don't really understand it. And I play the move knight to c4. Very calm, very, very simple move. Putting the knight on c4 and hoping that my opponent actually has to trade with that. My opponent has to trade. So he takes, I take back with the rook. My opponent decides to play his move queen to d3, and I bring my rook back to c8. There's no other good square for the rook. If I put the rook on c5, I thought that it could be in the line of fire of this bishop, so I didn't want to argue with that. Obviously, you can't go here, and if I go here, I'm kind of just in the way. Like a knight on b5 or d5 is going to hit my rook, and it doesn't make any sense to put a rook on c7, because it also blocks the queen in some lines. So I decided to bring it back to c8. My opponent goes knight to d5 now, and here is the worst move I've played all game. This move is really, really bad. If I'm playing a move here, I have to take the knight. But I overthought this position a lot. The point is why knight takes such a good move is after pawn takes, this pawn can be seen as a weakness in some lines, and computer already has like ideas of going pawn to b5. Which is nice, and the point is just stop c4, play pawn to a6. The square from the knight is kind of taken control of. I'm going to play the move queen a5. I'm going to go after this queen side, and my bishop's going to open up and become very strong. And if anyone's playing for a win here, it's going to be black. But with the move that I played, I calculated something else. What I realized was that, okay, I want to take this knight, but what I want to do with it, I want to see, okay, I see this little configuration here, this queen and this rook are there. I would love if a bishop could get there. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to like take this knight, and after pawn takes, I wanted to like take this knight, and then like my opponent would take with the bishop, and then I have a move like bishop b5 for skewering these two pieces. Of course, it doesn't work right now because the queen would just take the bishop, which is why I played the move pawn to a6, which makes sense logically in that way, but actually it doesn't make any sense at all because one, it allows my opponent's next move. But even if we go back in that line, even if I had this idea, let's just put it on the board here, takes, bishop takes knight, my opponent can just take with the queen. And I don't know what I have anymore. Of course, if he takes with the bishop and I get this, like, let's just say that the bishop's not hanging, I thought my opponent could even have c4. So I don't see the idea. I don't see the appeal to any of this. And I have no idea why I went for this. But this was just a horrible move. This move pawn to a6. But okay, we have chess to play, and it's not the end of the game just yet, but it's about to be, because after one mistake comes another, and this allows my opponent's next move, which is a very, very nice move. He plays the move pawn to c4, which is a very, very good move. And already I realize, oh no, now this is a different situation, because if I took here, and let's say played a6 now, after pawn to c4 we get this structure, which is fine. This structure is fine. For black, we have like a pretty reasonable play. This pawn is kind of weak. We're going to go against the queen side. We're going to open stuff up with a rook e8 and e6. But now after the move pawn to c4, no, pawn to a6, pawn to c4. Now if I take, my opponent's taking like this. My opponent's going to take with the c pawn. And this is a different story entirely. This pawn structure kind of limits the black pieces very, very much. Because this low connect 4 here, it's very, very strong. My opponent has a lot of play here. I don't really have the open file compensation, and my opponent actually has a great open file here. So I was already getting in my head here. I thought this position was pretty bad. You probably have to play the move like queen a5 and like pawn to b5, and computer says that black has some compensation for giving my opponent this amazing pawn structure, but okay, I didn't want to go for this, and I was getting very, very nervous. But in reality, I should be taking the knight anyway here. But I was scared. I was very scared here. So I thought for a little bit, and I decided to make a decision which just really haunted me for the rest of the game. I played the move pawn to e6, which is just another like terrible move. It's just another terrible move. And the point is, okay, I wanted this knight out of the way, and then I wanted to eventually play a move like d5. Maybe I want to play b5 at some point. Probably gonna like try to finagle my pieces in like some situation like this to play this move d5, and then I'm gonna get some play going, and that was like kind of my idea. I wanted to get something like that going, but pawn to e6, what it really does, if I'm not able to play the move pawn to d5 at some point, this pawn on d6 is just going to be a huge weakness for the rest of the game. And I knew that when I played the move, but I didn't really understand the full brunt of how bad it was going to be. So my opponent ended up taking my knight, which makes sense. I decided to take back with the queen to connect my rooks and put my queen in an active square maybe. My opponent goes pawn to b3, very logical, cementing this little structure here. And black has some serious problems. In fact, this is probably the last moment where black has like any play at all. And I should be playing this with pawn to d5 now, which works tactically, but I just didn't consider it at this point. I just thought that this couldn't work. Like ed takes, I just thought this couldn't work at all. I was just like, oh, why am I giving up a pawn like this? But actually, he just can't defend it. Like if he goes here, I just go rook e8, no, rook e8, sorry, put pressure on the bishop f2, and like, I mean, black is just much better here, and like most ways, yeah, black is just much better here. I don't even know, like, computer gives like h5, and I have like some attack, you know, like it's pretty good. Like, there's not much my opponent can really accomplish here, but I didn't find that because I'm human, and I didn't really see that I could just sacrifice a pawn like that. Instead, I put the rook on d8, which is just to prepare d5 in the future. I want to go bishop c6 and d5, and my opponent takes it, and I am taking back with a pawn to prepare d5 even further to get rid of my weakness on d6. Very logical. Opponent goes knight e2. I go with the move bishop to c6, trying to play this move pawn to d5. Again, d5 I should play now, but again, that's really, really difficult to do, so I didn't do that. Bishop to c6. My opponent goes bishop to d4. And I decided that the best form of action is to actually just give up my dark sword bishop, my bishop pair advantage over here. Because if I am to play this move pawn to e5, now if you look at the position, now I am never going to be playing d5. I'm never playing d5. So I'm stuck with this weakness for the rest of the game. And that's a very instructive little thing here, because if you're stuck with this weakness, you're just gonna have problems in all endgames, right? Like, I can't get rid of this weakness. I can never get rid of this weakness unless I do some like big finagling, like b5 for example, and my opponent has to take it, and there's some like problems there. But okay, that's not really ever going to happen. So in reality, I'm just gonna be left with this weakness permanently, and I don't want that to happen. So I decide to instead go with this, and with the pawns like here. Now d5 is still on the cards, and the position is much more close to equal. However, this position gets bad very, very quickly, as I'm unable to play d5 in any timely manner. My opponent goes rook fd1. Again, d5 is the best move, but I didn't think it worked tactically. I thought my opponent could like take like this, take like this, take like this, and I thought that this position was bad, but for some reason I just missed that the knight was hanging. No, I didn't miss that the knight was hanging. No, I missed that this pawn that the queen had to defend the rook. Okay. That's what I missed in the position. But really, I mean, can you blame me? It doesn't look like this should work. And so I didn't go with it. And instead I thought, okay, my king in some of these lines. Oh, this is what I calculated. Sorry, pawn to d5 takes. No. C takes, E takes. What was the line? Did I really just mess up my calculation? No, right? Oh, I did, huh? Okay, I did. For some reason, I was only considering moves like queen c3 at some point. I thought my opponent could put like queen c3, and there's like pressure on this pawn with the rook now, and now like I'm not threatening to open up. And for some reason, I thought this was bad, but I don't think it is bad. I think it's actually completely fine now that I'm looking at it. I don't see any threat, actually. Huh, that's really annoying that I miscalculated that. Instead, because of this idea, because of this miscalculation of this queen z3 idea, I thought that my king was actually misplaced on g7, and I didn't like that he had this check. So I decided to play the move king to g8, which I thought made sense at the time. But in reality, it's not that good of a move. My opponent goes queen to e3 now. Now, I cannot play the move d5. This is actual because e takes, and I can't take back with the pawn because my queen is undefended. So I decided to not have that happen. I'm trying to still play the move pawn to d5. That's what the whole position is about. So I play the move queen to f6. And the point is, now I'm trying to play pawn to d5 because the queen is out of the way. My opponent goes knight to c3, stopping pawn to d5 again, and I think for a little bit, and I play the move queen to e5, which is also a very, very nice move. And the point is, again, I'm trying to facilitate d5, and now my opponent can't take with the pawn because their queen is undefended. But really, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to induce my opponent to play this move pawn to f4, which I thought they were going to play, by the way, which I don't think is a good move, because after queen a5, and stuff like this, this pawn is actually weakened because the pawn on f4 has moved. And if my opponent goes here, now it's just a different story. Now black is actually just better because black has the bishop and has lost their weakness on d6. So that's kind of the point of queen e5. My opponent doesn't fall for it. My opponent goes with the move rook to d2. And now again, I'm really stressed because I'm trying to play this move pawn to d5. I really want to play this move pawn to d5. In retrospect, I probably should have played the move queen c5 here, which makes a lot of sense. Of course, if takes, probably I think that black is better here. I know the engine says 0.1 for white, 0.2 for white, and that's because my opponent's able to get to the d file faster. But I think that, in all honesty, black having the light squared bishop against the knight and all the pawn breaks in the position, I feel like black should have good winning chances here, and I'm not really that worried about black. But what my opponent would do is he would play the move king f2, and then there'd be some like tactics here. And again, I'm gonna try to walk my king over. My opponent's gonna go here, and we're gonna get a position like this, which is gonna be pretty interesting, and it's gonna be one that I probably am not worse in. I'm still defending, but I'm not worse in. Instead, I thought that this tactically worked, and I played d5. Unfortunately, this move does not tactically work, and it doesn't work very simply. I thought that my opponent couldn't take because I would take, and then if you take like this, I was calculating this line for a while. Take, and this is scary, but I thought that I had tactics here with queen a1 check, and then after king f2, I could play rook c2 check, and this is what I was looking at. Like king g3, I would take on a2. I have tactics here now, and this is kind of scary. Also, it's scary for me, by the way, but I thought this probably would work. King h6 only move, and then we just make a draw, I think. But yeah, so this is what I calculated, but unfortunately my opponent doesn't have to do that. And instead of taking the pawn, my opponent simply went rook cd1, And I realize that I have no way to defend the pawn. I can't take either of these pawns because my rook here is undefended. So I'm just losing. I'm just losing my pawn. So I think for a little bit here, and I'm kind of coming to terms with the fact that I just blundered, and now I'm going to be down a pawn, and I'm going to be in a worse position, but I'm still going to be fighting back. So I think for a little bit, and I decide to sacrifice the pawn on my own terms with the move pawn to d4, which I thought made sense. The point is that now I still have this open file access. My opponent's not going to like blow open my position with pawn takes and like put pressure on my bishop and stuff, and I really didn't want that to happen. So I decided, okay, I'm going to keep it locked, pawn to d4, make the most sense. My opponent's going to take back with the rook, and I'm going to try and keep pieces on the board. Well, sorry, no. I'm going to try and be active. I'm going to play this move queen to a5. Defending my rook from over here, keeping my queen pretty active, going like kind of pestering him on the queen side, getting some problems here. But again, you can see I spent a minute on this move pawn to d4, 20 more seconds here. I'm down 3 minutes on the clock in just a completely lost position. How am I going to be able to survive this? How am I going to be able to keep this going? And remember, I win this game. I win this game, by the way. So my opponent goes pawn to b4. And I decide that, okay, I only have one move. I have to play queen to b7. I can't play queen to b6 because of this check. Queen opens up against the queen. Rook is defended. I have to take here. I just lose the queen for a rook. So I can't do that. So I have to go to c7, the only square that defends the rook and keeps the queen alive. And my opponent goes pawn to c5. I decide here that it's actually a good idea to move my king up one more time, because there was that tactic earlier where I couldn't go to b6 because of the rook coming with check. So I'm like, okay, what if it's not with check anymore? That's interesting. And now I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I can make some progress in this position. Maybe I can kind of try and survive. My opponent, by the way, he's not taking this because this would lose a lot of his advantage. This would lose a lot of his advantage because he doesn't have the d file anymore. And now actually black has the d file, and black's trying to infiltrate. And yeah, these pieces defended for some time, but not always. And the queen needs to go do something. The queen needs to make progress for white. And you can't make progress when you're stuck defending the file like this. So my opponent doesn't want to do that. He instead played the move pawn to a4, which makes a lot of sense. He's simply trying to go pawn to b5, and that looks really, really dangerous because if he gets these pawns rolling, it could be really bad news. I think for a little bit, I find one of the best moves in the position. I play the move bishop to e8. The point is that if my opponent gets this move pawn to b5 with a tempo, then he kind of starts ripping everything apart. But after bishop to e8, now this move doesn't work. Now this move simply doesn't work because now I have queen c5. And you see why the king's on g7 now, because this wouldn't be a check. It wouldn't be a check either way because the bishop on e8 is defended, but black is winning now. So my opponent's not going to go for that. He instead went pawn to a5. I decided, well, okay, you're not going to play pawn to b5 anymore. Bishop comes back. pretty standard stuff. My opponent goes pawn to e5. I play the move queen to e7, trying to activate the queen on this side of the board because the queen is certainly not going to get out of this little pawn chain here. My opponent goes rook to d6, a very, very nice move. And I decide, okay, no more of this. I don't want any more tactics. Probably what he should have done is actually play the move rook d8, and now rook d6. And I think this is probably even better because now he's like, now he has one less rook off the board, and with one rook off the board, it's a little bit easier for my opponent to make progress. That's just the classic way of thinking. That's just the classic, common knowledge, you know? So I decide here after rook to d6 that I don't want to rook trade anymore, and I decide to play the move rook to e8. Retrospect, probably the move rook f8 is even better, but then again, it doesn't really matter. I'm still completely lost. Rook to e8. Now I don't want to rook trade. My opponent goes queen to d4, and I decide to activate my queen, give him some problems with the move queen to g5. And now you see the point of this bishop on c6. I'm threatening bishop takes f3. That's a bit of a threat, so my opponent has to respond to it, and my opponent, of course, doesn't blunder it. He plays the move knight to e4. Very logical move. Coming down here, he's putting some pressure on my queen. He's coming down here, and in some lines, he would want to get rid of this rook and put the knight on d6. I decide to go queen to f5. If the knight moves, I'm going to infiltrate over here. My opponent goes knight to f6. I play the move rook to f8, and my opponent goes pawn to f4. And now I have infiltrated into the position with the move queen to c2, which is my whole point. And hopefully I can start making some counterplay here. First of all, I'm threatening mate. My opponent doesn't want to get checkmated. Shocker, I know. And so he's going to have to stop that. He plays move queen to d2. Very logical move. But I want to tell you something right now, something that you might not have noticed. My opponent has 3 minutes and 13 seconds on the clock. I have 47 seconds. And I have had 47 seconds. I've had a minute since move 34. And my opponent has had 440. So I'm playing all these moves in like a second, in like 2 seconds. So they're not going to be the top engine moves. This is the top engine moves because I'm awesome. But most of these aren't going to be the top engine moves. They're going to be a little bit lackluster. It's going to be a little bit difficult. And my opponent's going to be able to start some sort of advantage. Queen to d2 is played. And I decide just in short time I play move queen to b3. Quick move, 2 seconds. Queen to b3. Now my queen is out of the way. I'm putting pressure on the pawn here in some lines, so my opponent can't go like here, because like he loses the pawn. Probably black is almost better here. So he decides to go rook to a3, and I think I'm forced here to put my queen on a4, which is kind of a depressing sight for a queen, and I'm just not in the game anymore, which is pretty disappointing. But I am gluing my opponent's queen to the fence of the b4 pawn. My opponent goes knight to d7. After some thought, I really don't want to trade the bishop, so instead I decide to lose a rook. Okay, so I kind of the audio kind of cut out here in the recording, so I'm going to have to re-record this. It's very, very sad. Yes, very, very sad, but okay, there's not much you can really do. In any case, we're just going to keep it up. I did some good analysis, but okay, let's try and keep it going here. Let's try and make sure that the analysis is still pretty high level. Okay, so I play this move rook f to e8 in low time, not entirely seeing that my opponent was threatening the move knight to b6, which I didn't see immediately, but okay, my opponent finds it because my opponent has time and knows how to play the position. My opponent goes knight to b6, and I am losing the exchange, which is, it's pretty bad, but it's not anything that I can't get away from. I decide to go queen b5, takes, and my opponent goes rook to d4. Probably what he wants to do is play this move rook d8, but he doesn't want to play it now because he loses the pawn here. And I'm sure this is what he saw. Of course, it's really dangerous for me now. Like, this position is terrifying, but he's kind of okay. He wants to defend the pawn. So before that, he decides to go rook d4. He defends it like this. Probably again he should play this move queen to c3, which makes a little more sense to defend the pawn like this. Or if he's going really aggressive, play rook b1 and defend the pawn like this. Is this a blunder? Why is this a blunder? I don't get it. Okay, oh, that's why it's a blunder. Yeah, rook b1 is bishop b4. So my opponent's probably not going to want to do that. But okay, like he kind of needs to defend the pawn before he gets his pieces moving. And that's what I'm going to be trying to make happen. Anyway, my opponent goes with rook to d4, and I decide to block him off with the move bishop to d5. My opponent should probably take the bishop here, by the way. Because if he takes the bishop, he kind of... Sorry, not in this position. He has to defend the pawn first. He has to go with a move like queen c3. Then he's going to go after here, and he's going to be up a pawn. Well, up 2 pawns. But he decides to not do that. He plays queen to c3 first, which is just a better move. He's going to be taking the bishop on the next move, and he's going to be kind of doing some damage to my structure. I think for a little bit, and I play this move rook to c6. Why did I play rook to c6? I don't know. I really have no idea. I think that the point was I wanted to play this move pawn to b6 at some point, and like pawn to a5 and put some pressure here. But then again, it doesn't really make much sense, and my opponent should be playing the move rook takes d5, which he does play. Rook takes d5, e takes d5. But here my opponent messes up. Here my opponent messes up and gives me a second sign of life. And instead of playing the very, very simple move rook takes d5 and being up 2 pawns in the position, my opponent goes e6 check, which on its own makes sense because I have to block it. My opponent's queen is attacking my king, and he's getting this passed pawn, which is going to be beneficial to him. If I go king to g8, for example, my opponent goes here, here, and infiltrates with the queen immediately. I guess not right now because of queen b4, but okay, let's say rook d5. My opponent gets some pressure here, and it will eventually be infiltrating with the queen and the rook, and this position is already lost, already hopeless for black. So my opponent should be going with this, but instead of like going king g8, I play the move pawn to f6, and now my opponent panics. My opponent panics here. He has to play the move queen e1, which admittedly is a very difficult move to find to defend both pawns like this, and I have to go with a move like rook c8 and like come back and defend the pawn. In the meantime, something like this will happen. He can not do this because of takes, and rook d1, but like in most cases, he's gonna be fine. He's gonna be fine. It's not gonna be the most difficult position. And with 2 minutes on the clock to 31 seconds, my opponent should be able to figure that out. Instead, he panics and he plays the move pawn to e7, which just allows me to pick up the pawn. And now black is kind of getting back into the game because I have this move rook e6, and my opponent can't do anything about it. And probably he should take this pawn. He has to take this pawn, really, because if he doesn't, then he's not going to have any more advantage, and black is going to be fine. So that's amazing. But instead of taking the pawn after rook e6, my opponent plays the move rook e1, which equalizes the game for black. So, amazing, really equalizes the game for black because he can't defend the pawn anymore. In the other case, he's able to trade these two pawns, but now, after the move queen to d7, I'm just going to win the pawn. You take, I take, the pawn is lost. You go with the move like queen d4, you get checkmated. So like this is amazing. You can't even defend, you can't even like attack my pawn. You go queen d2, I simply take. You take, mace. Like, oh my goodness, like everything's working out for me, and I'm already like extremely happy. My opponent trades the rooks, he goes king to f2, avoiding this checkmate idea, and I take the pawn, and we're in an equal endgame from a position that was +6 for white with like a minute on the clock. And now my opponent has a minute on the clock. I have 28 seconds left, but that's a much better time difference than what, like 4.5 minutes to 1. So I'm like ecstatic. I'm like ecstatic here. I'm like, oh my god, I'm able to survive. I've actually managed to like eke out like an equal position against this guy. Oh my goodness. And my opponent goes to the move queen d4. I play queen to d7. I defend the pawn, and my opponent goes pawn to g3. And now I start bringing the king f7. Bringing the king in the endgame is something that you do almost universally, because the king is a valuable piece and deserves to be in the center when you can't really get checkmated there. So my opponent goes king to g2, which makes logical sense. His idea is that he kind of wants to, with king to g2, his idea is that he wants to stop infiltration with the queen, and he wants to play this move pawn to h3 at some point, which is why he does that. King to g2, I go queen to f5. Very logical move. The point is I want to go king to e6 at some point. Maybe I want to trade off the queens, and I don't want this pawn to be hanged. I don't want my queen to be blocked. My opponent goes pawn to h3, and here I make a mistake under time pressure. I should play this move king to e6. I really should play this move king to e6, and now like the position's probably pretty good for black. Because after like queen e3, queen e4, my opponent has to go with king f2, because if you take, this position is already losing, because my king is just so much more active than his king, and his king has to deal with this pawn. So king d5, this is just a sample line. f5, my opponent's king cannot get back in time to stop me from taking all these pawns and winning the game. So seeing that idea, I played queen e4 now. But the reason why queen e4 now doesn't work, and I saw this, why queen e4 doesn't work, is after queen takes e4, pawn takes e4, my opponent is actually faster than I am. My opponent is actually faster than I am. This is why it's +1. My opponent has this very, very nice move, pawn to b5. And this is actually, it's difficult to say that it's +1. I feel like it's almost winning for white because the position is just so dangerous. But the reason why is +1, and why I can't take this pawn, by the way, is because after takes, my opponent would go c6, I would take, and my opponent would go a6, and my opponent promotes first. And I saw this during the game with the 22 seconds I had on the clock, but luckily my opponent didn't see this. And the reason why it's only +1 is because king e7, my opponent can't take, by the way, because I just walk over and win the pawn now. After king e7, my opponent goes c6, I have to go king d6, and I actually just lose all my pawns and play this position. My opponent goes here. It's probably a draw, by the way. I don't think either of us can make progress. I'm just going to shuffle here. My opponent can't leave this area. These pawns do nothing. My opponent can't leave this area because, of course, my passed pawn. It's probably a draw. The engine doesn't really know exactly what's going on, but luckily I'm not lost. But my opponent doesn't find that. King f2. I played move f5 because I didn't realize it. I had basically pre-moved this move. I played in 1 second. King e3, and now king e7, and I'm winning the game. Pawn to g4, king to d7, king to d4, and king to c6. My opponent can't go farther away because I block him with this pawn, and I come forward and I win these pawns. My opponent goes gf, gf, and king c4, and I know this, and I play the move pawn to e3. King back to d3, king to b5, takes is a mistake, by the way, but like load time is crazy. I have to go king c4 only move. Really nice. And the point is that now he wastes a move. If he comes here, I come here. My opponent zugzwanged again. If you go b5, I take with the king. I take this pawn with the king. Why can't I take this with the king? King d4, right. So I have to take this pawn with the king, takes, and then takes. I guess I can also take with the pawn. It doesn't really matter at this point. But okay, I decide to take the free pawn. My opponent goes king d4, and I take on a5. And now we're in a bit of a pawn race. King e5, king b5 takes, push, 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 queen, queen. But I'm giving the checks first, and my opponent has 2 seconds on the clock. I play the move queen e1, king d7, queen d2, king c8. I realize I have no more checks in the position. I play this move queen to c3, gives me a check. I take the pawn. King b8, king b6, queen c8. Now it's mate in 3, but I don't see it. It's mate in 3 like this. Here, 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 and mate. But I didn't see that. And of course, if you block with the queen, I can just take here and mate. Instead, I just take the queen. King c8, king c6, push, 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 push. And in this position, my opponent runs out of time. But of course, the position is completely losing for white. And this is how I managed to win this position with a +5 position for white. If we go back here, yeah, like +4 here, and down 3.5 minutes on the clock, which is crazy. And and what's even funnier is that I managed to win this on time, which is just hilarious. I mean, it just goes to show like how much practice like time management has in your games, and how it really is something that should be practiced. But okay, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys found this entertaining, instructive, all of the above. I really hope that this one records the audio. And I will see you later. Good evening and good night.